setting of this. 5 years ago, next Monday, the 162 members of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress of the People's Republic of China passed unanimously within 15 minutes of starting their meeting the law of the PRC on safeguarding national security in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, known ubiquitously since as the National Security Law, NSL, what we're going to talk about tonight. That evening, Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, effected the document by signing it. It went into operation the following day. As protests bringing 1 million or more people onto the streets at any one time had swept through Hong Kong over the previous half dozen years, conjecture had naturally reached fever pitch about Beijing's response. Instead of People's Liberation Army deployment, 1989 style, a law was enacted. Some identified swiftly the NSL's significance, many did not. And briefly, the setting for this. In June 2014, the State Council of China issued a white paper called The Practice of the One Country, Two Systems policy in the Hong Kong SAR, claiming comprehensive jurisdiction over the territory. It said the high degree of autonomy of the HKSAR is not full autonomy, nor a decentralized power. It is the power to run local affairs as authorized by the central leadership. The fairly new, so 19 months in, General Secretary of the CCP, Xi Jinping, clearly detested and rejected the formula introduced by Deng Xiaoping, who's now his only reputational rival as the party's second most significant leader after Mao Zedong, of one country, two systems. This formula implied that while the party must, of course, rule the PRC mainland indivisibly, a different rules-based system might be permitted to operate in the Hong Kong SAR. This aberrant concession must end, Xi believed, and believes, or the rot of separation of power might infect other regions. The white paper insisted, for instance, that Hong Kong judges must behave primarily as loyal, patriotic officials of the PRC. Following up the crucial shift in policy driven by the white paper, the MPC Standing Committee announced that for the next election of a Hong Kong chief executive, a nominating committee would be formed, mirroring the 1,200-member election committee to nominate 2 or 3 candidates, each of whom must receive the support of more than half the members of the nominating committee. Thus, candidates for the chief executive role must be effectively pre-screened through a structure loaded to ensure all are approved by Beijing. Immense disappointment from people who had thought that under the 50 years arrangement, there will be a slowly evolving democratization in Hong Kong. And the umbrella movement followed, immense and then unprecedented protests led by students. And then when the chief executive, Carrie Lam, announced her intention to have a law passed permitting extraditions to the mainland, even larger protests, 1 million people or more. COVID eventually provided some cover for tougher reassertion of central control. And it was at this point that the NSL was introduced, establishing as crimes subversion, terrorism, collusion with foreign organizations, and secession, the latter including any speech or intention to encourage or consider Hong Kong's separation from the PRC. A special office was created that was placed beyond Hong Kong's jurisdiction to enforce this law. The authorities were granted powers to surveil search and detain people suspected of any of these new crimes, which followed mainland PRC provisions, including substantially crimes not only of deeds, but of discourse, crime of which Kevin is clearly guilty by being having
allegedly guilty.
Yes. Oh, sorry, allegedly guilty. I was interested to see that Xia Baolong, the director of the Hong Kong Macau Affairs Office, has in the last couple of days made a presentation in Hong Kong, in which, in effect, pretty well every sentence of his presentation, he declared Hong Kong a security city. So no longer an entrepot between China and the world, no longer a place where certain freedoms are trialed, but a security city. I wrote a book after living in Hong Kong for 5 years, in which I wrote just after a couple of years after the handover in 1997, in which I raised the possibilities of Hong Kong going in different directions. So I called it Comrades and Capitalists. Which way is Hong Kong mainly going to go? And the answer is now far more clear. And one can say that the national security law has been at the center of these driving these changes. The law and I want to first ask Kevin about the white paper that Xi Jinping imposed quite soon after he came to power, which seems to have driven a lot of this stuff pre-NSL. How significant do you think this white paper was in setting out the program for the full integration of Hong Kong, for driving the ensuing protests, and for changing the nature of the legal system there?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Rowan, for chairing this session. And I will also very much like to thank the AIIA's Victorian Division for, unusually enough, I guess, having a wanted criminal as a guest. And look, and I know full well that I'm not the foremost expert on Hong Kong or Chinese law in this room. I can see a number of you here who can talk about any of these things more knowledgeably than I can. But I guess I've got the notoriety, don't I? Look, Ron, the 2014 white paper that you've described, for people in the know at the time, like if one looks back at the commentary about the white paper back in 2014, it was appreciated both by pro-Beijing and by pro-democracy scholars and commentators and politicians as a turning point. You had Chang Yuk-sing, who used to be the president of the Legislative Council in Hong Kong and a long time pro-Beijing politician, saying that it was a sign that Beijing had lost patience in Hong Kong's autonomy. You had Professor Johannes Chan, the former dean of the Hong Kong University Law School at the time, saying that it was a turning point, just like Chang Yuk-sing did, that there are concerns that maybe China would now go in a more, what he called at the time, a more conservative direction when it came to Hong Kong. But I guess for most Hong Kong people, myself included, we were stupid. The reality is that when an authoritarian tells you what they're going to do, take them at face value. And we kind of, especially those of us who, and I'm sure, Anthony, you've worked in the same circles, who worked in big international commercial law firms and so on, and in big investment banks and what have you, would think, no, they're not going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg, and that giving, of course, they might not give Hong Kong democracy. I mean, the British didn't either, but ultimately, there was a feeling that they would leave Hong Kong as it was, perhaps without democracy, but not much worse than that. And I guess even for those who said that it was a turning point, if you were to ask people like Zhang Yuxing and people like Johannes Chan on the pro-democracy side, whether it was going to end up quite this draconian, I bet even back then they wouldn't have thought it was going to go in quite that sort of direction. And interestingly, because it took them some years to get to the national security law and its aftermath, so it took them 6 years to enact the national security law, and then now we're 5 years on from that. I think by the time of 2018, 2019, most Hong Kongers actually forgot about it. And it took a piece of proposed legislation about the possibility of extraditing people in Hong Kong to China for all sorts of laws that woke Hong Kong people up from the possibility that things might go very much for the worse and that they better speak up for one last time. And in fact, I remember in 2019, a leading China watcher in Hong Kong, he still works as a journalism professor in Baptist University in Hong Kong, called Bruce Liu, was saying that as part of this idea in Mandarin, it's 逢九必乱, that every year that ends in 9 under communist rule has often been chaotic, whether it's been the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, Tiananmen, Falun Gong, you name it. Bruce Liu at the time, back in 2019, was saying that Hong Kong was right at the bottom of the list in terms of places that they thought they needed to worry about. They thought that between 2014 and 2019, when they kept letting the Hong Kong professional classes make their money and to speak out on things, but really clamping down on the rights of pro-democracy politicians to serve on the Legislative Council, and they thought that that was going to be as bad as it gets. And that they thought they had Hong Kong pacified. How wrong they were, and in fact how wrong we were, that we thought that it wasn't going to get any worse.
Indeed. So let's go forward to the NSL. You were working as a lawyer, I think, in Hong Kong at the time when the NSL was introduced. Can you fill us in with how important it appeared to the legal profession and others at the time, whether people anticipated quite how transformative that would be for the city? As you say, many didn't appreciate the white paper, what its intentions were, and then the NSL. Did people see that? And generally, can you set up the mood in Hong Kong? Because it just COVID was just advancing in 2020, and so what was the mood in the city, and how did people, particularly in the legal profession, how did they view the NSL imposition?
Look, I think it's fair to say that to a large degree in the early months of the NSL being in force, the naivety continued. We thought that, because in the first few months, all they really did was to arrest a few post-NSL violent protesters. And whilst that was obviously not pleasant, I think a lot of us probably felt that maybe it wouldn't go much further than that, and the law was there to scare people off more than anything else. But again, I mean, another lesson is when an authoritarian does something, believe them and take them literally, it came very quickly. In fact, I mean, by the latter half of 2020, they started arresting dissidents en masse. They, at the time, they arrested them, released them, and then by early 2021, most of them were charged, and then they were locked up, because one of the things within the NSL was that pending trial, there's a presumption against bail. So if we think of Victoria, where there are laws, presuming against bail, that applies in relation to really violent alleged criminals and the like. In Hong Kong, it was national security, right? And if you want to know what national security means, well, let's look at the definition of China's national security law, which is basically anything. So anything, literally anything. So if you think of any area of public policy, financial, health, education, law and order, laws, you may name it, any area that might be touched by public policy, that would be covered by national security. And they arrested, for example, newspaper proprietor Jimmy Lai. He's been undergoing trial for subverting state power and colluding with external forces. There's been a group of over 40 democracy activists and politicians who've been convicted of one holding a primary election for who would represent the pro-democracy camp in legislative council elections, and two, as part of that, saying that whoever would win seats in the legislative council would block supply in return for promises of democratization in Hong Kong. And if you think about, if you think about it, that what it means to say that blocking supply is subverting state power. One, actually, the Hong Kong Basic Law has express provisions on what happens if there's a blocking of supply. So it's not like they're doing anything illegal. And secondly, I mean, whatever your political views on Australian politics are, on Labour, Liberal, or whatever, can you imagine if there was a law in Australia in 1975 that would lead to the entire Liberal National Party room being locked up for blocking supply in the Senate? That's essentially what happened in Hong Kong, all right? So, I mean, I can go on with lots of other examples, but let's, we can keep going and talk.
Thank you, yes. And a very good friend of mine was locked up for this. She was jailed for 3.5 years for her role in organising primary election, and she thought that was her democratic duty.
Exactly.
And she wanted to win local election. And of course, the pro-democracy parties have won a huge victory not long before at the last fairly free general local elections allowed to be held in Hong Kong, didn't they?
Yes, and in fact, so what happened was the last free and fair elections in Hong Kong were the 2019 District Council elections in November in 2019. That was against the backdrop of many months of intense protests. The pro-Beijing camp was really confident of a massive victory. They believed at the time that a silent majority of Hong Kongers would be sick and tired of all the road blockages, shop closures, various acts of violence, and even by Western standards, vandalism and what have you. So confident were they that the Central Government Liaison Office had directed the leading pro-Beijing newspapers in Hong Kong to pre-write stories to be ready for release as soon as the result came out, to talk about victory for common sense and what have you. And in fact, even on the day of the district council election itself, they were still very confident of that because they saw a record high voter turnout because it's voluntary voting in Hong Kong. And they thought that must mean that the silent majority was going to decide things. Well, the silent majority did decide things, but it was the pro-democracy camp that won over 80% of the seats. And what made it, I suspect, more galling were images in the week after. There were literally, like the South China Morning Post being Hong Kong's sort of leading English language newspaper, and literally, and you can search it on Twitter or X, whatever you call it now still. There was literally footage of people, professionals and business people in central business districts in Hong Kong, dressed head to toe in expensive designer label gear that were going around pouring. I'm trying to convert. Like in Hong Kong, it would cost they would cost around $250, $300 per Australian per bottle. Pouring bottles of Dom Perignon in the streets, offering it to pedestrians, and everyone being so happy that they wiped the pro-Beijing camp out. And I kind of think, look, obviously, I'm not so naive as to think that Beijing didn't already decide on a crackdown because they had their fourth party plenum before the district council elections, and even then they were talking about making changes to Hong Kong's legal system. But if I were Beijing and I saw that a group of people who are considered elites and who are people that I would have thought would be on my side and would be sick and tired of all these quote unquote riots, and yet they're out there pouring Dom Perignon, decked out in Chanel and Louis Vuitton and what have you, glorifying and celebrating my demise. That must have been a last straw for them.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Now, I wonder if you can outline for us the ways in which the NSL has impacted on a range of institutions. Well, if you can hold back on the legal system, because
sure,
that's kind of a whole big thing I'll ask about afterwards, but how has it impacted on the political system, media, not-for-profit sector, including trade unions, and the economy, including the finance sector, that was then your professional focus?
Wow, you're asking me to
regurgitate. This is a big question.
You're asking me to regurgitate my upcoming PhD thesis. Yeah. Goodness. Look, I'll try and be as brief as I can. The easiest piece in some ways, but also the saddest piece, is the political piece. They've pretty much locked up all the people, well, a lot of the people who can oppose them. And those who are not locked up are actually finding it quite difficult to find work. So recently, there's been a former pro-democracy district councillor who's been sacked twice on the same day because she had two jobs. One job as a member of a drama troupe, and another job as a teacher at a Hong Kong school. Shouty creative. Anthony would know very well what I mean when I talk about that school. And she was sacked twice within the same day because her drama troupe was about to put up a production that was considered not politically friendly. So you're finding that even for people who are not jailed, they're finding it difficult to get employment. I know, I won't name her, there's a former leader of a political party, pro-democracy political party in Hong Kong, who was on the cusp of getting a number of NGO jobs in Hong Kong post-NSL. She had support at the secretariat level of these NGOs, but once it went to the board, they blocked her appointment, and she's now doing postgraduate studies in Australia. So on the political level, and then there's also the fact that the Legislative Council can now, you can only be a member of the Legislative Council or the District Council if you're considered a patriot. You get vetted as a candidate, okay? So if you get vetted by various committees and they deem that you're not patriotic enough, you can't even be a candidate. And as a result of that, if we look at the 2021 Legislative Council elections, where it was quote unquote patriots only, Hong Kong people have lost interest. So the voter turnout rate has dropped from the traditional about 60% for Legislative Council elections down to less than 30. Okay. So if you can imagine, it's basically all the pro-Beijing voters coming out and voting for themselves, right? So that's on the political level. On the education level, we're seeing a lot more insistence on patriotic education. There are flag-raising ceremonies and so on, even in kindergartens. There's a lot of compulsory school trips to mainland China to learn about, glorious patriotic history and all of that. If we look at finance, in fact, I'll stop and not talk about finance. I'll come to that next. If we look at small business first, literally last week, there was news coming out that if you want to run a restaurant, if you want to run a bar, if you want to run a live music venue or a live theatre venue or anything like that, one of the license conditions they've now put in is that you're not allowed to undermine national security. Okay, so basically, if you do anything, leaving aside even the criminal law risks of being locked up, at the very least, they can shut your business down. But even before they impose those licensing conditions, pro-democracy shops have been constantly harassed. So basically, I know that there's been restaurants where every second day they would, or every week they would have, the fire services department saying that they're not doing fire safety right. There's going to be the food and hygiene department going to inspect. There's going to be, there's all sorts of those things, constant harassment, basically. And then, okay, that turning then to, more the big end of town of finance. If we're going to talk about live stories, then the most recent one would be Hong Kong's richest man, Li Ka-shing, who owns CK Hutchison conglomerate. He and his conglomerate was trying to sell their interest in the Panama ports to BlackRock, US interests. Purely commercial reason. Anyone can see writings on the wall geopolitically. Let's sell out before the interest in Panama is worth nothing. And now that's been ground to a halt because China was not happy. They were threatening to invoke the national security law on them. China itself has said that this might be anti-competitive. I don't know how. It'd be against competition law. But in Hong Kong, there's been a lot of talk about trying to use the national security law to stop Li Ka-shing from selling his interests. Now, if you ask me what provision they can use, we think a lot when it comes to national security law in terms of locking up dissidents and all of that. But actually, there is a provision in the national security law that deals with, that creates something called a National Security Committee. And the National Security Committee has the power to direct any private or public institution or individual to do or not do anything, so long as it has anything to do with national security. And as I've described earlier, national security can be anything. So therefore, they have the right to rule by decree over anything. And in fact, that committee had already exercised its powers, for example, to cancel the work visa of media tycoon Jimmy Lai's British lawyer had used those powers to stop political prisoners from being released early on parole. And there are other things that we wouldn't know about. These little snippets we only knew about because there were court proceedings that were stopped as a result of these National Security Committee directions. And so Li Ka-shing can potentially be stopped in the same way. And so you've got a little bit of a rule by decree environment, creation of business uncertainty. Yes, there's a lot of talk about the Hong Kong capital markets coming back. You might or might not have read articles about how there's an expectation that Hong Kong might again be a global leader this year for the value of listings, initial public offerings. But that's got to be looked at against a number of pieces of regulatory developments. One, the China Securities and Regulatory Commission has made it much more difficult for companies to list outside of mainland China, and that includes Hong Kong. There's been a long backlog of listings applications in Hong Kong since COVID as a result of the CSRC in China going through prospectuses and draft prospectuses with a fine-tooth comb. Many of my friends who are working on capital markets projects have been complaining about how long that has taken. And some of the comeback that we are seeing in Hong Kong this year is kind of partly a clearing of that backlog. That's the first point. The second point is that there's actually been some regulatory changes when it comes to prospectus disclosure. So in the past, there had been rules that said that you should have a section talking about specific China-related business, legal, and regulatory risks. As a result of the CSRC having issued a directive saying that any Chinese company wanting to issue outside of mainland China cannot have anything in their prospectuses that denigrates the Chinese political and legal and business system. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange has dropped their listing rules requirements over the disclosure of China-specific risks. So we're talking about a very different disclosure environment there. And there are also plenty of stories flying around about buy-side equities analysts basically holding back on being frank on the prospects of Chinese companies because they're worried about being accused of undermining national security. Now, finally, on the media front, I know you've asked about that too. The reality is that a lot of media outlets have been shut down, and those that remain have to self-censor to varying degrees. And those that try not to self-censor, in fact, there's been a recent story about that, have been harassed by the Hong Kong Inland Revenue Department with individual journalists and independent news outlets having been subject to tax audits with incomes being asserted against them that they never earned, and putting a lot of pressure on them, saying that you have to pay all of this in advance, pending any objections that you might have. So the media scene is under a lot of pressure as well.
Thank you. And let's go on to the law. So the legal system, as we know, was held up from the handover as being the core of the special autonomous status of the PRC as an attraction under the one country, two systems formula, the British common law system surviving intact and so on. What's been the the impact of the independence of the legal system on its common law status, and maybe then you can go on to talk about the judges who are on the court of Hong Kong's appeals court bench. We've got 3 Australian judges there still left, I think: Patrick Keane, James Alsop, William Gunno, and then there's 2 Brits and a Kiwi. I'm interested also in why the Aussies have stuck it out on that court when everyone else, a whole load of others have quit. So what's the impact on the legal system, and what about the judges, including the foreigners who are still there?
Okay. Look, it would be, I know that there are a lot of Hong Kong democracy activists out there that would love to give you a simplistic answer to say, oh, the rule of law is gone, okay? I'll try and give you as nuanced an answer as I can on this, okay? Look, with cases that touch on politics, then there's probably a stronger argument for saying that the rule of law has been significantly undermined in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong government boasts about its near 100% conviction rate on national security cases and related political cases, saying that that's a sign of how good our prosecution team is. Okay. Now, it might be said, look, I know that it's very easy for people to think, oh, does that mean that Beijing is telling the Hong Kong judges how to rule their cases? I would like to think not. But in some ways, I would suspect that it's actually more insidious than that. So don't take it from me, take it from former Dean of Hong Kong University Law School, Johannes Chan, who's written on this. Take it from a former Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal foreign judge, Lord Jonathan Sumption, who's quit. The point basically is a legal and political environment has been created, right? And if you're a judge, you do not live in a vacuum. And it doesn't take very much for, and us lawyers, because we spend our lives acting for clients, right? It doesn't take much for us to rationalize our way into thinking that we are just applying the law, okay? And if we think about, what sort of environments being created, it's not just the NSL. I mean, if we look at, for example, the current Chief Justice of Hong Kong, Andrew Chang, he's done a number of very interesting things. So first of all, there's been a long line of Hong Kong case law that affirms separation of powers within the Hong Kong legal system. But after separation of powers has been criticized as a concept post-national security law, during the opening of the legal year in 2021, Hong Kong Chinese media asked him, so what's the status of separation of powers in Hong Kong? And he said, that term has become politicized, let's not talk about it, okay? So again, that sort of thing doesn't get reported by the English language press because it's the Hong Kong Chinese media that had the guts to ask those sorts of questions. He, in 2022, or was it even 2023, he visited the head prosecutors division in Beijing, during which he gave some remarks about how great the national security law is and how much, Hong Kong is going to be, the Hong Kong judiciary is going to play its role in moving Hong Kong from chaos to prosperity. And if we look at personnel changes, there was a judge, district level judge in Hong Kong who at one stage was taken off political cases by the previous Chief Justice after he praised a pro-Beijing individual who stabbed a pro-democracy protester nearly to death as having noble sentiments. Now, under the current Chief Justice, that district court judge was reinstated and is now one of the designated national security judges. So if you're a judge and you see all of this happening, you don't need to be told, right? So that's on the political cases side of things. Then on more the commercial and non-political cases, this is where I think the conversation around the rule of law, it has to be a lot more nuanced. It's easy to just to say, well, on the one hand, you can say, oh, let's separate political and non-political cases, and you can have a bifurcated rule of law. On the other hand, you might, there are people who say, oh, no. Once one thing is gone, it's all gone. It's actually a little bit more subtle than that. And what you're finding is that, look, there are some problems with the Hong Kong legal system that's got nothing to do with politics that predated the national security law. Things like the lack of judges, the shortage of judges, things like long delays in the court system and so on, okay? And that's actually been made worse by the national security law, not directly, but indirectly insofar as there's been quite a number of judicial retirements, but at the same time, they've had trouble recruiting the next generation to become judges. And might I say that with a few exceptions, the few that have agreed have tended to be at the much lower court level, have, dare I say, have had relatively less distinguished legal careers before they joined the bench. And so with both the shortages and the caliber of people that are now joining the bench, there are a few good people who joined in recent years. Don't get me wrong. I'm talking about the preponderance of the situation. What you've got to be concerned about there is not so much political control, but more quality control, right? Are cases, non-political cases that are litigated in Hong Kong going to take even longer now? Going to become even more expensive because of all the delays. As some of these judges that are appointed post-NSL work through the ranks up, the judicial chain, what's going to be the impact on the quality of legal reasoning and judgments coming out of that? Purely in terms of quality of personnel, because a lot of people don't want to become judges anymore. And you might ask why. Two reasons. More practical reason is that a lot of successful barristers are thinking to themselves, I don't know what's going to happen in 5-10 years, okay? So why don't I make as much money as I can now? And if things turn out fine in 10 years' time, I'll reconsider then. Another thing is, obviously, there are some barristers who don't want their names tainted by the system, but a mixture of that has meant that, there's been a shortage of good people wanting to become judges, and that has its downstream impacts. So if Hong Kong's going to lose out to Singapore on commercial litigation, it's not a direct result of the NSL. It's sort of your more second or third or fourth level impacts, okay? And finally, you asked about the foreign judges on the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal. As at the time when the Hong Kong NSL was introduced, there were around 14 foreign judges, and you're talking about some of the best judges on the common law in the common law world. Okay, and now we're down to 5. There are 3 Australians. Well, actually, down to 6 now because they recently appointed a New Zealander, 2 Brits and 1 New Zealander. And why has there been that drop? I mean, a few just got really old and died, like Lord Walker of Guessingthorpe. He literally died. And there are, sorry to those of you in your 90s, and there are a number who said they were getting old and thought that, for example, former High Court Chief Justice Murray Gleeson resigned because of age, and there's no reason to suspect that it was anything other than that. And then there are people like Lord Sumption and Lord Collins of Britain, who and Baroness Hale and Jim Spiegelman from Australia, who were concerned about the NSL basically, and about what's happened afterwards. Now, and recently we've had former Chief Justice Robert French, who quit that court, who said, he disagrees that the Hong Kong courts have been compromised, but he felt that maybe the whole thing's become anachronistic, and maybe one day Hong Kong should copy Singapore and Dubai and have a specialist commercial courts where the foreign judges can go back and join again. Okay, now why? Look, it's not really for me to speculate why the three Australian judges remain there. They must have their own reasons. I can only observe objectively, and I'm not saying that these are their reasons. And first of all, I really have to thank them for their selfless service to Hong Kong. I know that they mean very well. I think first of all, and without this being disparaging of the Australian judges, the reality is that because of colonial links, and let's face it, a bit of Hong Kong legal sector snobbishness, traditionally the silks, the King's Council, Queen's Council from other jurisdictions that have worked in Hong Kong have tended to be British. So you've got a situation where just by virtue of interaction and experience, not by virtue of ability, British judges in their time previously as practitioners would have had a lot more links and experience with Hong Kong compared with Australian judges. So they are much less susceptible to the sorts of arguments which say, well, we need you around to be our last line of defense. If you go, we're stuffed, all of that stuff. I think they have more eyes and ears in Hong Kong independently of the authorities compared with the Australian judges. It's also fair to say that and again, I'm not saying that that's why the Australians stayed, but as an objective fact, that since the British judges have mostly left, apart from Lord Neuberger and a 93-year-old Lord Hoffman, Australian judges have been assigned to a wider variety of cases that previously would have tended to have gone to the British judges. So I'm not saying that this is a 100% thing, but in the past, there was a tendency for more public law cases to go to Australian judges because we've got a written constitution and the British don't. Whereas the Brits, thanks to London being a commercial litigation powerhouse, tended to be given more the commercial cases, and then you've got them sharing the criminal cases. But since the Brits have left, there's been quite a number of commercial cases where Australian judges have had, very eminent Australian judges have had opportunities to get their teeth into big and interesting commercial cases. For those of you who are lawyers, Justice Gummow wrote a very interesting judgment on Quis Close Trusts last year. Okay, that sort of case, query whether it would have necessarily gone to him if there was still a full contingent of British judges around.
Thank you.
I can be very short on this one, not a lot.
And if I could just finish by saying, I think we should give the last word to Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore, big rival to Hong Kong, and he said before the handover that he forecast that Hong Kong would soon enough become just another provincial Chinese city. My view is that perhaps one is freer in Shenzhen, just across the border today, than one is in many ways less under strict watch than you are in Hong Kong itself.
Can I make a quick final observation on that point? And that is that in many ways, it might now be as bad, if not worse, to be a dissident in Hong Kong than in mainland China.
Yeah.
Because in mainland China, look, say all you like about the lack of legal due process or whatever. If you speak up in mainland China, there's actually levels of, you might say, illegal, but nonetheless effective gradual escalation. So they would start by warning you, then they would invite you to tea at the police station. They might make you sign a confession saying that you've been naughty. They'll censor you. They might even send people to beat you up and occasionally not let you leave your home. But it's only if after all of those stages that you keep going that they would, really seriously lock you up and you are never heard from again. Ironically, because Hong Kong, they love parading themselves as a city of laws and processes, they can less rely on some of these murky areas, and they go straight to locking people up.
And giving you $1 million bounty.
Sorry. Oh, yeah.